Hello, Michael Over here, Shoreline Community College Associate Faculty. This video is for my English 101 online course. Today we're going to be talking about introduction paragraphs. A little bit later in the quarter we'll talk about middle paragraphs and conclusion paragraphs. And there's kind of this generic idea that we should write an introduction for any essay, right? But what does that mean? And so I just want to focus on introductions and specifically introductions for personal narrative essays. Again, we'll look more closely at different types of introductions for your other essays as they come up. However, with your introduction paragraph for the personal narrative due this week, I wanted to give you a little bit more detail about how I view introduction paragraphs and the idea of what should be in them. So the way that I want to start is I want you to imagine that you're at some social function, some sort of social gathering, a party or a dinner or whatever. Maybe an orientation for Shoreline. Who knows? Whatever it is. And a stranger comes up to you and introduces themselves. And I want you to think about what they're most likely to tell you. Chances are they might begin with their name. They might include their job, especially Westerners. We like to sort of identify ourselves, in connection with our job. They might tell you where they're from. They might tell you a little bit of something else about themselves, right? They're providing context or background of who they are. What are you most likely to ask them, right? What things would you be curious about? Maybe you want to ask, do you like your job? Do you like it here at Shoreline? Do you have any hobbies? Whatever it is that's actually allowing you to get some additional background and context about who that person is just within the introduction. And you can also think about the things that you would say to somebody if you were to introduce them or introduce yourselves to somebody else. So much like those introductions at a social gathering, an introduction should introduce the topic. What are we going to be talking about? Provide context and background. Why are we here? What's gotten us to this point? Why are we reading this story? Should establish the author's perspective. How does the author feel about the subject or the events? Should provide the reader with an idea of what to expect in the essay. What are we going to be reading about? And we'll look at this differently too in a personal narrative. It's going to provide some idea of what the climactic moment will be. Again, if you go back to the Freytag triangle. In a more academic essay, like a literary analysis or rhetorical analysis or persuasive essay, that's probably going to come about primarily with your thesis. And the fifth and final one is to define any necessary terms. Necessary terms could include a technical term that not everybody would know, or if it's a term from another language or something like that. So again, that whole goal of the introduction is to provide our reader with all the necessary information that they need to get into the story or into the essay. So what I want to do is I want to look a little bit more closely at three of the examples that I had you read for this week, three of our mentor texts. And we've already gone over 4th of July by Audre Lorde and The Chase by Annie Dillard, and you can go back to those as well if you need another template. But I want to start with the Moth Radio Hour piece that I had you listen to, a piece by Erin Baker called Good News versus Bad. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase what I think is her intro. And it begins with her saying, when I was about 12, my mother took me into the living room and told me that she was pregnant. I was never really close to my mom. She was kind of intimidating. But I remember when my brother was born 8 years ago, and everybody was really excited, and now she doesn't seem very excited. Okay, so let's just unpack that. In the introduction, what do we find out? We find out Erin Baker's age. We find out her relationship to her mother, and we find out that this pregnancy has come up, and we could, as close readers, or listeners in this case, anticipate that it's going to have something to do, that is, the story is going to have something to do with this pregnancy. Let's go to another example. So let's go next to David Sedaris' piece, Me Talk Pretty One Day. Um, what I'm going to say here is that I think the introduction for this piece is actually the first two paragraphs, which is okay in a personal narrative. There are a couple reasons why I'm going to advise against that with the more academic essays we write later this quarter, but I will address that as they come up. So I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs, what I consider the introduction, and then we'll unpack it. So Sidar says, at the age of 41, I'm returning to school and have to think of myself as what my French textbook calls a true debutante. After paying my tuition, I was issued a student ID which allows me a discounted entry fee at movie theaters, puppet shows, and Festiland, a far-flung amusement park that advertises, with billboards picturing a cartoon stegosaurus sitting in a canoe and eating what appears to be a ham sandwich. I've moved to Paris with hopes of learning the language. My school is an easy 10-minute walk from my apartment, and on the first day of class, I arrived early, watching as the returning students greeted one another in the school lobby. Vacations were recounted, and questions were raised concerning mutual friends with names like Kang and Vletanya. Regardless of their nationalities, everyone spoke what sounded to me like excellent French. Some accents were better than others, but the students exhibited an ease and confidence that I found intimidating. As an added discomfort, they were all young, attractive, and well-dressed, causing me to feel not unlike Pa Kettle trapped backstage at a fashion show. Okay, so what do we learn here? Much like Aaron Baker, David Sedaris starts with his age, and Annie Dillard does something similar, right? Kind of her age comes up early on. He also provides us information about the fact that he's going back to school, where he is. He's in Paris. I believe it's Paris, isn't it? Yep. And how he feels. And in the very first part of the introduction, the first paragraph, he seems pretty confident. In the one that follows, we learn that he's a little bit intimidated by his classmates and feels a little bit out of place. Now, hopefully you've read this story, but even if you haven't, you could probably guess what the conflict is going to be here. Is probably going to have something to do with learning the language, because that's what he's set up in that first part. It's provided the context, right? It's the same thing as in that introduction at a party, explaining who we are and why we're there. Okay, let's look at one more example, and I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief. So the next one I want to discuss is How to Tell a True War Story by Tim O'Brien. So he says, and I'm going to read what I think is the introduction. He says, "This is true. I had a buddy in Vietnam. His name was Bob Kiley, but everyone called him Rat. A friend of his gets killed, so about a week later, Rat sits down and writes a letter to the guy's sister. Rat tells her what a great brother she had, how strack the guy was, a #1 pal and comrade, a real soldier's soldier, Rat says. Then he tells a few stories to make the point, how her brother would always volunteer for stuff nobody else would volunteer for in a million years. Dangerous stuff, like doing recon or going out on these really badass night patrols. Stainless steel balls, Rat tells her. The guy was a little crazy, for sure, but crazy in a good way. A real daredevil, because he liked the challenge of it. He liked testing himself. Just man against gook. A great, great guy, Rat says." Okay, so what do we learn from Tim O'Brien's piece? Well, first of all, we get in the very first sentence the theme that's going to go all the way through this story, which is the question of truth. What is a true war story? We also get a sense of the characters, and we know that it's probably going to be primarily about the narrator's time in Vietnam. We know that it's going to be about life and death and uncertainty, and that sort of continues through. We also learn how these characters talk and a little bit about how they think. Now, maybe some of you have read the entire collection of short stories, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. This comes very late in the book. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it is the last chapter of that book, or the last story in the book. But what he gives us is this sort of introduction into questioning what truth is, setting up where he was. We don't learn his age. He doesn't say, when I was 19, I was stationed in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Instead, he comes at it from a slightly different angle. All three of these, and if we bring in The Chase and 4th of July, all of them provide a similar sort of idea. They provide context, they provide background. As a good reader, we could anticipate what the conflict is going to be. It's going to be about mom's pregnancy. It's going to be about learning French. It's going to be, trying to figure out what truth is in the middle of something chaotic and odd and surreal like a war. Now, the other thing I like about all of these examples that we've brought in, or that I brought in, I guess, and that we've read, is that they're all vastly different. Different levels of seriousness, different levels of sort of detail. How to Tell a True War Story has these really graphic descriptions of gore, and The Chase has these really great descriptions of the cold. Me Talk Pretty One Day has these great devices that bring out the humor of trying to learn a new language. The other thing that I'll mention just before I kind of end here is you could think about, and you should think about, how the title of each piece relates to the introduction and relates to the entire story. Okay, so just to recap, we've talked about introductions, we've talked about how they should provide context, we've talked about how they should establish who the character is and who is speaking, and your personal narrative intro paragraph is due later this week. That is, of course, to help you get a little bit of momentum, to help you get back into the writing groove if you've been out of it for a while, and also so that you can get a little bit of feedback from me. Since the intro paragraph sets up the essay that follows, I can help you probably mostly by letting you know if you're on the right track. If you want to write a story about the time your bike was stolen, and I think that it's going to be about the time you went on a trip with your best friend and got lost, then there's probably a disconnect there. Who knows? All right. Email me with questions, post to the discussion boards. Otherwise, keep an eye out for the next video, and we'll go from there. Have a good one.